So we are halfway through Romans. Let's review a little bit. We said it's kind of in four movements. So the first movement, chapters 1 through 4, all humanity is trapped in sin and in need of rescue. Rescue won't happen by trying to follow the Torah. God's righteousness has rescued the world through Jesus in order to create the faith-based, multi-ethnic, multicultural family rooted in God's promise to Abraham. The second movement kind of gets into more theological uh, kind of a theological area. That Paul presents this idea of an old Adam. It's the old way is you're enslaved to sin. Jesus is like a new Adam, new kind of humanity. He says, leave your old Adam behind, die to yourself, be drowned in the waters of baptism, and rise with Jesus. Evil, which is sort of personified, has hijacked the human heart so much so that the Torah itself couldn't overcome it. Jesus, however, took on the guilt of humanity and gives the Spirit to liberate the human heart for renewal so that people can truly follow the Torah's commandment to love God and neighbor. So, 1 through 8 is sort of like one really big thought. It's not exactly a run on sentence, but it almost kind of acts like one. So then the question becomes, okay, well, what about Israel, right? What about like the Israelites who don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah? Has God abandoned them? That's kind of the question in 9 through 11. Has God abandoned his people? So Paul recalls the past. He says, "Hey, remember back? Remember he's going back into the Torah for so much of this. Um, remember, he says, simply being genetically Israelite doesn't mean that you're in the covenant family. Um, there's always a subset. He says, remember, God's plan went through Isaac, not Ishmael, not his brother Ishmael. Went through Jacob, not his brother Esau. This line of, you can imagine like the family tree, and then there's this zigzaggedy line through it. It extends to the followers of Jesus, both Jew and Gentile. He says, remember, people inside and outside of God's covenant have rejected God, but Paul shows how God used their rejection to accomplish his purposes. Remember Pharaoh, right? God used Pharaoh's rejection of God to accomplish what God was trying to do. So that's like Israel in the past. Now he says, what about Israel in the present? He says the reason that some reject Jesus, remember, this is like 20 years after Jesus' life, death, resurrection. He says the reason that some people reject Jesus is that they've still got this idea that the covenant relationship with God is based on this sort of performative aspect of the law. Like, I have to follow these rules, and therefore I'm in God's covenant relationship. But he says, sadly, they don't recognize, and he's got this like sense of anguish. He says, sadly, they don't recognize what God is doing, creating this new covenant family that's not based on following rules, which they don't do anyway. It's based on the righteousness of Jesus. So we've done Israel's past, Israel's present. Now he starts talking about Israel's future. So he says, is God done with Israel? And in my New Revised Standard Version, it says, by no means. But actually, the way Paul says it in the Greek is kind of crass. And it's like forceful. It's almost like he's saying, hell no, God's not done with Israel. He says there's tons of Jewish followers of Jesus, right? Including himself. And some rejectors too, whom God uses to accomplish his purposes. And all of this causes God's gospel, the good news of Jesus, to spread even further, not just within Israel, but to the Gentiles, to people who aren't Jewish, which makes the family of God larger and larger and larger and larger, more multi-ethnic. There's this undertone of almost, and this is oversimplifying it, but like beware of racism in Romans, because this whole thing, Jews and Gentiles, is really an ethnic thing. People coming together. He says the family of God is kind of like a tree. There's branches being broken off, and there's branches being grafted on. This is a new kind of family. Gentiles and Jews, Israel and not. But then he says, he ultimately tries to answer this question: has God abandoned his people? Because remember, God made this promise to Abraham, right? Is that promise no longer good because Jesus is in the picture? No, he says, no, one day all of Israel will be saved. Even with all he said, he says, but in the end, all of Israel will be saved. One day, Jesus, he says, will be acknowledged by all Israel. How? He says, I don't know. I don't know. They just will, because uh, God doesn't abandon his people. God is not going to break his promise. So on that, you might add that verse there, 11:26. All Israel will be saved in spite of their hardened hearts. How? Paul's not so sure. He's like, I've been doing this pacing around this room, but I can't put into words exactly what I'm trying to say. I don't know how they're going to be saved. And so instead, he starts singing. He starts singing a hymn about in God's sort of inscrutable ways. How can we possibly understand the great things that God is up to? Right? It's almost sort of Job-ish. If you remember, we just finished reading Job. So how can Israel be saved? Maybe they don't need Jesus. Maybe eventually they do come to accept Jesus. Maybe they're saved through Jesus some way without even realizing it. Maybe it's something else. We don't know. Paul says, I don't know. I just know that God will keep his promises. So let's review then this movement in Romans. Um, Israel in the past, there's always been a subset who are part of God's family and a subset who aren't. Israel in the present, some are still understanding the covenant based in following the law. In the future, is God done with Israel? No. A new family is being created by grafting and pruning, but in the end, all Israel will be saved. So we're coming up toward the end. I hope you're following along. Continue to read slow. Continue to go back if you're not sure about something. And happy reading.